Breathe. You've made it out of the noise. I'm Amber, and this is Not a Glitch, a show about building workplaces where people can actually thrive. If you're back from the last episode, welcome, and I'm glad you found your way here again. Last time, we talked about why you're not the problem, and today we're aligning on the language we use to say that. If this is your first time here, Episode 1 gets into my background and why I've spent so much time thinking about this. But for now, here's the short version. I've had 2 decades in tech support, studied psychology later in life, and lived a lot of this myself. That's where the confidence to say, you're not the problem, comes from. In my experience, the very first hurdle we have to cross in communication is how we speak to and about each other. Most of us learned the rules for this completely by accident. Nobody sat you down and explained it. You just picked up cues over time from coworkers and friends, articles and books, from that one meeting where someone got corrected in front of everyone and you quietly filed it away. So here's a scenario. You're talking about a coworker and you say a person with autism, and someone else says an autistic person. Are you supposed to know which one's right? Did you just get it wrong? But here's the relief. There isn't exactly one right answer, but there's a way to think about it that actually makes sense. It's easy to assume there's plenty of information out there, that anyone can go educate themselves. But outside of a college campus or an advocacy space, that kind of deep dive research is a mental luxury a lot of people simply don't have time for. So if you didn't already know this, it's not a character flaw. It just means nobody's walked you through it yet. So we're going to do it today. The neurodivergent community has widely voiced a preference for identity-first language, saying an autistic person rather than a person with autism, or whatever specific term fits best, ADHD, dyslexic, whatever it is that they are using to describe themselves. And this is called identity-first language. And the idea behind it is that being neurodivergent isn't something separate from who the person is. It's not an accessory or a diagnosis riding along. It's a part of them, permanently. And it's not something that can be fixed or cured. Hopefully by now you've caught the trend that this lines up with the whole not a glitch point of view. We're not trying to fix people. Our attention is on the system. So where does a person with autism still fit in today's language? We're actually still in the middle of a shift, and one that we'll dig more into in episode 3. Person-first language, such as a person with autism, was given preference by the medical community and parent advocacy groups who wanted to create distance between the person and the diagnosis so that they could focus on treating the disorder itself. Groups like DAN, Defeat Autism Now, built their entire movement around that framing. And if you imagine the same energy in a slogan like Defeat Autistics, it's a lot easier to see why creating that distance felt necessary at the time. But here's the thing. Language doesn't stay still, and neither does understanding. What made sense to a generation trying to separate a person from a disorder doesn't always make sense to the person who's actually living it. And increasingly, people living it are the ones setting the terms. My call for you for this section and for today is if you hear someone using person-first language out of habit or out of just ignorance, it's okay to offer a gentle update. Not correct them publicly or make them feel foolish, just a quiet, hey, a lot of people prefer it this way now. But there's one exception, always. If someone is talking about their own personal experience, their own identity, they get the final say, full stop. It's their narrative, their words, their choice. Nobody else's preference overrides that. not mine, not the community's, not even the general trend we just talked about. That includes advocates. Even the most well-informed voice in the room doesn't get to override someone else's choice about their own story. Labels are a wonderful communication shorthand that allows people to quickly identify and place us in a certain category of people that lets them relate to us on that level. The problem comes in is when we are reduced only to that label and not seen for the wonderful individual that we all are. We embrace every bit that doesn't fit, and we don't make people fit where they don't go. That's a lesson I've personally had to learn over my adulthood years, and I very much started out in the don't put me in a box category. But over my life, I've had to see my own labels as I've embraced them, rejected them, and how they've evolved over time. I've lived through gender identity changes and how language has evolved around gender. I've had changes in my political labels. But the one that is probably easiest to talk about is my heritage. As an Army brat, I latched on to the idea that my family was from Minnesota, and I identified fully as Minnesotan. You'll still hear it in my vocabulary every once in a while. I like my long O's, but overall, even if I didn't live in the state, even though I had only been there on summer vacations, it's what I identified myself with. It's where I called home. Now, as a mid-40s adult, and I haven't lived in the state again for coming on 10 years, I've pulled a little bit back from that label. The family roots that have tied me to the state have dissipated. I have very few immediate family that still lives in the state. And I've embraced more of where I'm living now. That doesn't mean that I quite fully identify as a Coloradan, but I don't cling to the Minnesotan label as much anymore. That doesn't mean that I may not find something that talks about my heritage more later on, but at the moment, again, my labels are still evolving. But now let's talk about the labels that go behind neurodivergent and neurodiverse, which actually I've been throwing around those terms a lot, so it's probably time I explain what they actually mean. I, personally, am a neurodivergent person. That means that my mental experience and functioning fall outside the social norm, outside of what's considered typical, which brings up the word on the other side, neurotypical, meaning someone whose functioning fits within society's current idea of normal. We already know I have a problem with that word, but we're going to let it sit until episode 3. Neurodiverse works differently. It describes a population, not a person. Think of it like biodiversity. A healthy ecosystem isn't made up by one kind of plant. It's made up of many different ones growing together. And human brains work the same way. Across the world's population, there isn't one blueprint for how a mind works. There are countless ones. And neurodiverse is a word for that mixing and coexisting together. That word can apply just as easily to smaller groups too. A team, a friend group, a family, as long as there's enough variation in how people's minds work within it. And here's the part that surprises people. A group of neurodivergent people can be just as neurohomogeneous, meaning similar to each other, as a group of neurotypical people. Neurodiverse isn't about who's in the room. It's about how much variation exists in that room. And I want to call out a common mistake when it comes to neurodivergent and neurodiverse. Unfortunately, a lot of people do use them interchangeably, saying, I am neurodiverse, when you mean I am neurodivergent. People will probably still know what you mean. It's just bad grammar. And consider this your gentle nudge. Just one more term when it comes to describing neurodivergent people, and it's my personal favorite. neurospicy. It's what a lot of us in my personal friends group use, and it's grown in popularity. It means neurodivergent, but playfully. And honestly, I love it because it takes normal completely out of the equation. It's not defining me against some baseline. It's just me, spicy, no comparison required. And I look forward to the day it doesn't flag spell check. But did you notice something? In all these words that I've used and all the definitions, I've never used a medical term or diagnosis in the definitions. And that's intentional. The people who coined neurodivergent didn't want it to require one. It's an umbrella term covering a wide range of experiences that may or may not have a medical explanation behind them. It can be innate, an ingrained part of someone, something like autism or ADHD, or it can come from a life event, a traumatic brain injury or a stroke. And either way, it counts. Personally, I've labeled myself ADHD, both autistic and ADHD, but I've only ever been medically diagnosed with ADHD. I take medication for it daily, and it helps me keep my mind on task instead of running my batteries empty by noon. That medical label gives me a clear path to the support I need. But I've been slower to pursue a diagnosis for autism, partly because there are fewer medical or social supports waiting on the other side of that diagnosis. But the label ADHD has still done real work for me. It's helped me understand myself, and it's helped me find my tribe, so I can learn how to better manage my life and my symptoms. And there's no diagnosis required for that. But the other side of labels, they do cut both ways. They can shape how an employer sees what I'm capable of, or lead someone to attribute my struggles or even my successes entirely to a diagnosis instead of it being linked to just who I am. They affect how people see me. Sometimes they can even affect where I can choose to live if I ever decided to leave the US. When someone learns my labels, what they often see isn't a person. It's a list. Challenges, obstacles, things to account for. Me as a person, second. And this is why one of the community's newest and most important labels is undiagnosed. Seeking medical certification is a personal choice, one that weighs real risk and real reward, not to mention time and money for anyone who identifies as neurodivergent. I know there are going to be people who hear neurodivergent and assume it's just the latest trend, a way of seeking attention for being different. But those of us on the inside of these terms know how painful being on the outside of normal can actually feel. So instead of arguing whether or not it's real, I'd rather you to celebrate that diversity. Acknowledge that everyone experiences the world differently, even you, regardless of whether or not you fall under this umbrella term or not. This isn't a fad. It's just true, a reality of nature, and we see it play out in every biosphere. Now, there's so much more to say about the role the medical field plays here, how diagnostic labels can end up gatekeeping the very support they're supposed to unlock. But that's a deeper conversation, and it's coming in episode 3. So bear with me. We want to cover some more language first. How we use language, while social at its core, is an extremely personal process. It's built from all our previous education, reading, conversation, and experiences, all rolled into a few seemingly simple word choices. And no wonder we get confused so often. So if you find yourself uncertain about the language somebody's using in a conversation, I'd invite you to try a few things. First, most important is to ask clarifying questions about what the word or phrase specifically means for that individual. When they're talking about being neurodivergent, what their experiences are, what they struggle with, what they excel at, what makes them most proud. for being who they are. The word has specific meaning for them. My neurodivergency may not match yours, your neighbors, your friends, but it does mean something. We want to align on that. Second, this goes back to our active listening skills, is to paraphrase your understanding of what they said so that they have a chance to agree with you or offer a correction before mistakes take root, before you get too far into the conversation and you're now having to backtrack and reframe everything that they've ever said. It gives you a chance to challenge your own assumptions about the word or phrase and what it means, because your definition and theirs might not be the same. So that's it. Those are the labels we are talking about today. And I didn't want to overload you, but there will be opportunity for us to add more vocabulary, more labels, and get further into the discussion as words come up throughout the show. But I wanted to give you a preview of some things that I'm working on and some things that I hope are reoccurring parts of the show. And this first one is being called patch notes. Every episode, we're going to take one thing leaders commonly say, a kind of phrase that feels harmless and even kind. And we're going to break down how it actually lands for a neurodivergent brain. And then we're going to talk about what to say instead. Not to make anyone feel bad for the phrases they've used, as most of us have said all of these, but because small wording choices can quietly remove a whole lot of friction. Think of it like a software update. Same intention, better execution. So here's a phrase you've probably said or heard a dozen times this month. When you get a chance, can you look at this? Socially, that phrase is meant to soften a request. It signals no rush, whenever works. But at work, free time isn't really a thing most people have. And managers often reach for it, not to be misleading, but to avoid sounding demanding, to bring a little social warmth into a work request. But for a neurodivergent brain, that phrase can start a small internal tug of war. One side takes language literally, processing requests as concrete instructions. It doesn't hear whenever. It hears a command with an invisible deadline attached. And now it's stuck guessing what that deadline actually is. Today, this week, before the next meeting. The other side remembers every time this phrase has been used before and knows logically it's supposed to mean something relaxed. But recognizing the social intention doesn't make the literal meaning go away. It just adds a second voice arguing with the first. And if the manager tacks on a no rush for good measure, the second voice doesn't always win. The vague phrasing was meant to feel relaxed, and it ends up creating quiet anxiety instead. So what should get said? Something with an actual timeline attached. Can you get this to me by Thursday? Or even, no rush, end of the week is fine. Some intended flexibility, but the guesswork is gone. Turns out, being specific isn't more demanding. It's actually kinder. Okay, and one more thing before we close out for today. Another regular piece of the show, I want to introduce a concept that's going to sit underneath a lot of what we talk about this season. The double empathy problem. And here's the idea. For a long time, when neurodivergent and neurotypical people struggled to understand each other, the assumption was that the neurodivergent person was the one missing something. Some social skills, some piece of the puzzle they hadn't picked up. The double empathy problem flips that narrative. It says communication breakdowns go both directions. A neurotypical person struggles to read a neurodivergent person just as much as the reverse is true. Neither side has a deficit. They're just running different operating systems. And no one wrote a manual for translating between them. And that's actually the entire point of this segment, which I'm calling the source code. Every so often, we're going to pull out a word the neurodivergent community uses to describe our own experience in our own language. So you've got real vocabulary instead of guessing. And today, we're just going to throw out two really quick. Masking, the effort of hiding or suppressing neurodivergent traits to appear more neurotypical. It's often exhausting. Often, it's also invisible to everyone around the person. It's such a universal part of the neurodivergent experience. We're actually going to be dedicating all of episode 9 to it. So we're only going to touch on it briefly here. The second term is stimming. Repetitive motions or sounds like tapping or rocking or humming that help regulate focus or emotion. You're going to hear this one come up through the season, and it's largely associated with the autistic experience specifically, though not exclusively. Neither of these are problems to fix. They're just part of how some of us move through the world. But that's the source code for today. It brings us back to where we started. Language is the basis of how we communicate with each other, agreeing that certain sounds, movements, and expressions are tied to specific ideas or concepts. But it's easy to get lost in translation, even when it sounds like we're speaking the same language. We made a good start today, but there's still a lot of room for all of us to build a deeper understanding of each other. We'll keep coming back to language and communication throughout the season. This isn't a one and done. It's an ongoing conversation. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, including episode 3, where we dig into the social model of disability. But for today, thank you for finding us. This is Amber with Not a Glitch. And until next time,